Unplugged In.
It's a very sad thing what's happened. They don't have water, they don't have food, and we are helping a lot.
U.S. President Donald Trump confirming secret talks with top Venezuelan politicians on the fate of a country racked by food shortages and economic collapse. Can new sanctions and high-level negotiations ease the suffering of the Venezuelan people?
Our desire is to see this peaceful transfer of power and have really true free elections.
Coming up, my interview with White House National Security Advisor John Bolton and VOA's one-on-one with Venezuela's interim president Juan Guaido on U.S. and Venezuela, Sanctions and Secret Talks. Hello, welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren. Now, it used to be one of the richest and most stable countries in South America, but today, Venezuela is a failed state. For the majority of Venezuelans, that means no food, no medicine, no jobs. But there are fragile signs of movement with the admission of secret talks between the United States and Venezuela about the political instability and the economic collapse that has gripped Venezuela since 2015. More from Plugged In's Millar Saga.
Every week, thousands cross the Simón Bolivar Bridge seeking greener pastures in neighboring Colombia. Venezuelan families who cannot afford food or medicine in a country increasingly divided.
Venezuela no es una.
There are two Venezuelas. The division, the differences are very strong. There's a segment of the population that manages to have a relatively stable life economically because they have important access to foreign currency. And there is another Venezuela absolutely impoverished on the verge of extreme poverty.
The United States has thrown its support behind Venezuelan opposition leader Juan Guaido. But behind the scenes, U.S. President Donald Trump confirms back-channel negotiations with members of President Nicolas Maduro's inner circle.
We are talking to the representatives at different levels of Venezuela, yes. I don't want to say who, but we are talking at a very high level.
High-level talks that Maduro claims were directly authorized by him.
I confirm that for months there has been contact with senior officials of the United States government, of Donald Trump, and the Bolivarian government that I preside over under my specific and direct authorization.
But the U.S. State Department warns the Venezuelan leader against overconfidence, saying Maduro's days may be numbered.
The only items discussed by those who are reaching out behind Maduro's back are his departure and free and fair elections.
Venezuela's ambassador to the United Nations accuses the U.S. government of aggression against the people of Venezuela, and he urged the UN Security Council to investigate recent U.S. economic sanctions as acts of war.
But this is an act of war, what the United States is declaring against Venezuela in front of everyone for no reason. Venezuela is not a threat to anyone, and the United States is fabricating this aggression just to take the oil.
Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves at more than 300 billion barrels. Millar Saga, VOA News, Washington.
Plugged In has reached out to the White House, and a senior administration official tells us that members of Maduro's inner circle are continuing to reach out to government officials using various methods and channels. Bricio Segovia is the White House correspondent for VOA's Spanish service. He joins us from the West Wing of the White House. Nice to see you. And tell me, what is the status of these talks? Are they actually moving forward, and who's speaking to whom?
Hello, Greta. Thanks for having me. Well, as you just said, there are talks between high-rank officials of the Venezuelan government, Maduro's government, and the U.S., according to both sides of this story. According to White House senior officials, there are still talks happening, according as well to the president of the U.S., Donald Trump. These talks are happening between the senior officials of the Maduro entourage and also the senior officials of this administration. But something pretty funny actually happened here. When the president of the U.S. admitted that these conversations were taking place, Nicolas Maduro also said, yes, I'm aware of all these conversations. They've been happening for a long time. But on the the other side, we have Maduro's number 2 official, Diosdado Cabello. The AP actually broke the news that he was one of the Venezuelan senior officials talking to the U.S. government. But he said, we are not talking, and I would only do it under 3 conditions. That would be, number 1, Maduro must approve. Number 2, talks must take place in Caracas. And number 3, I would only talk to the U.S. government if we are here to talk about Venezuela. But what we see is this contradiction of Maduro's number 2 denying any contact with the U.S. administration and Maduro saying, no, these conversations are actually happening.
Well, are Maduro and his number 2 on the same page? And it seems like when you say Maduro is aware of the talks, is he in agreement that they should move forward, or simply that somebody in his government is having these talks? Is he on board?
Well, that's what we don't know. We don't know exactly if these conversations were taking place with Maduro knowing, being aware of these conversations. Actually, what these people might be wanting to get out of these conversations, according to the U.S., is some sort of warranty that when Maduro steps down, they will be okay. They won't be facing any legal consequence. Now, what we see here is that everyone is playing this game of trying to portray or trying to be seen as they are in power. They know what is going on, and they're not taken by surprise by any of these movements. That's the game that Maduro is playing. Maduro wants to be seen internationally as someone who is in control of the situation, and he's aware of these talks, even though this might not be the case. We don't know. And Diosdado Cabello, maybe he, spoke a little bit too soon when he said that these conversations weren't taking place because Maduro obviously said something different.
All right, one quick question. We only have less than a minute left. One of the conditions is that the talks must occur in Caracas. Now, Norway has been trying to broker some settlement in Barbados. Why is it that it has to be in Caracas? Is that a requirement? Is Maduro afraid to leave Venezuela?
Well, yes, Maduro at this moment doesn't know what is going to happen if he leaves Venezuela. He has no warranty at all that he's actually facing the international law, international justice. There are several cases open at this moment in the international court against him and some of his people. So that is one thing. Also, it is important to note that Maduro's government stepped down these conversations in Barbados at this moment. These were the only conversations that were happening between the opposition and also the government of Nicolas Maduro as of now.
Mauricio, thank you. Mauricio Segovia, White House correspondent for VOA's Spanish service. Now, the man leading the charge to impose new sanctions and oust Maduro from office is White House National Security Advisor John Bolton. For weeks, he has been sparring online against Maduro and his top officials, accusing them of destroying Venezuela's economy and violating the rights of its people. I spoke with Mr. Bolton about his support for the opposition and the United States' desire for free and fair elections in Venezuela.
Well, that we are entirely behind their justifiable desire to be able to control their own government, to get rid of this authoritarian military regime that's basically ruined the economy of the country over the last 20 years. The nations of the Western Hemisphere are almost unanimously behind their desire to see a peaceful transfer of power. 56 governments have recognized Juan Guaido as the legitimate interim president. That's the first time that there's ever been that kind of rejection of the Maduro regime. So times are hard in Venezuela now. That's because of 20 years of mismanagement of the economy. But our desire is to see this peaceful transfer of power and have really true free elections.
All right, in terms of the economic hardship, part of it is due to sanctions. And the president has just upped the sanctions. So how do you respond to that? People in Venezuela may say, yes, our country's on hard times, but these sanctions don't help us.
Well, the sanctions have been in place for roughly the last 6 months. 20 years of economic mismanagement are really responsible for the country coming to a halt economically. When Chavez took power 20 years ago, Venezuela pumped an average of 3.3 million barrels of oil per day. when the sanctions started, they were down to 1.1 million barrels of oil per day. 2/3 reduction of drilling in oil in the country with the largest petroleum reserves in the world. This should be a very wealthy country, but 20 years have really destroyed the economy. The pressure we're putting on is on the regime, on the military, and on the leadership of the country that's basically stolen its revenues for 20 years.
The new sanctions are broader, and I think, and I don't want to misquote you, but you basically said, correct me if I'm wrong, that countries who do business with Venezuela are on notice, that they better be careful. What does that mean?
Right.
Am I right in that quote?
That's right, and that says to the government that we are going to prevent them from getting revenues that they've benefited from these last 20 years. We're also going to increase our effort to stop their trafficking in illegal narcotics out of Colombia and other places. And it's to say to everybody else that does deal with the regime that if you want to deal with a democratic Venezuelan government, which is coming in the future, stop dealing with Maduro.
All right, well, dealing with Maduro now includes Russia, China, and Cuba. So what's the message they should get from that?
Well, they should stop interfering in Venezuela's internal affairs. You know, the opposition estimates there are between 20 and 25,000 Cubans in Venezuela. They're really paramilitary and military functionaries. They may not wear uniforms, but they're there not simply to support the Maduro regime, but to run it. And I would make this prediction: if those 20 to 25,000 Cubans went home at noon today, by midnight Maduro would no longer be in power. So if you're a Venezuelan, you should be asking yourself, why is our country going through all this turmoil to help support Cuba?
Well, the sanctions, I suppose, are meant to put the squeeze on Maduro, perhaps get people to turn against him, his military. So far, with the earlier sanctions, we haven't seen the effect of the more recent ones. The military hasn't turned against him. What's your explanation for that?
Well, I think that the rank and file in the military, the enlisted personnel, the junior officers, are overwhelmingly anti-Maduro. I think it's some of the top officers who have benefited from the corruption that the Maduro regime has perpetrated that are keeping the military together. But you know, if the military were really loyal to Maduro, they could have been called out to stop the opposition long ago. I think Maduro and his cronies are afraid of giving a direct order to the military because they might not obey it. The military, if it had the right leadership, would support the people. Instead, Maduro relies on the Cubans. He relies on these colectivos, which are motorcycle gangs of thugs paid for and organized by the Cubans. This is not a legitimate regime. This is not a regime that complies with the Constitution that Hugo Chavez wrote for Venezuela.
How long do you think it'll last, that can Maduro last in your mind? Because I mean, I know you believe in the sanctions, but what is your sort of prediction on a timeline?
Well, I don't think within the regime itself you see much stability. I think the top officials of the Maduro regime are like scorpions in a bottle. They don't trust each other. They know that they're all talking to the opposition to see what kind of deal they can cut. So I wouldn't be surprised if that instability plays out even before the government is actually turned over to Juan Guaido and the National Assembly. And I think it could come at any time. It's lasted longer than we wanted. The opposition did make a nearly successful effort back in April, and it's too bad because the suffering the people are undergoing now would be alleviated beginning as soon as we get rid of this regime.
I don't see any sign that Maduro's caving, that he feels in any way that he's in trouble.
Well, I think he knows he's in trouble. That's why he's afraid to walk the streets of Caracas or other major Venezuelan cities. Juan Guaido and the opposition do it all the time, despite the threat of arrest, despite the torture and murder of some of his supporters. You know, we know from the UN Commissioner for Human Rights, who did an investigation, that in the last few years, somewhere between 7,000 and 9,000 Venezuelans have been killed by the regime for political reasons. Just recently, they arrested a Navy captain for purportedly plotting against the government, and they tortured and killed him. This is the sort of thing, the people of Venezuela know this. And that's why ultimately the regime cannot survive.
Do you see any military involvement by the U.S., or will this simply be a sanctions economic approach?
Well, President Trump has said from the outset that all options are on the table. We have 100,000 perhaps American citizens, many with dual citizenship, in Venezuela. There are tens of thousands of Europeans and other foreign citizens there. It's certainly not our desire to see any military intervention. We want a peaceful transfer of power. We hope the regime doesn't cause even more havoc than it has already. But nobody should think that we're going to allow this to continue. Let me give you another example. There are probably now 5 million refugees from Venezuela in other countries around the hemisphere, in Colombia, Peru, Brazil, and other countries. It's the worst humanitarian disaster in the history of this hemisphere.
I have been actually down to the border of Colombia and Venezuela, and I've seen just lines of people strolling out of Venezuela. I mean, it is quite a humanitarian crisis, but is the U.S. motive an economic one, a national security one, or humanitarian one?
Well, it's all of the above. I mean, we feel very strongly that countries external to this hemisphere like Russia and China, Iran, their surrogates in this hemisphere like Cuba, really need to conduct their business in a very different way. This is for the people of Venezuela, to be sure, and it's one the most significant aspects of the opposition to the Maduro regime is how widespread it is among the governments of this hemisphere. I was just in Lima a few weeks back to attend a meeting of the Lima Group, some of the leading countries that oppose the Maduro regime. And what was striking was, so there was the United States in the hall, filled with the leaders of Latin American countries, speaking in Spanish to the people of Venezuela. This is not an issue made in Washington. It's made by the people of Venezuela and supported by others in the hemisphere.
With your warning to the other countries that do business with Venezuela post the second round of sanctions, are you in communication with Russia or China, and are they saying anything to you about Venezuela? Is Venezuela becoming sort of a political football or national security football with them?
Well, we've spoken both to Russia and to China. The president's spoken specifically to Vladimir Putin about it. I thought one of the most interesting things that Putin said was, you know, they can't make economic decisions in Venezuela. He was basically saying the Maduro regime has taken this oil-rich company and impoverished it. I think the Russians and the Chinese need to be very careful how they proceed here. They are owed billions of dollars by the government of Venezuela, and if a new government comes in and decides that that debt was illegally contracted, they could repudiate it.
We'll have more on the international stakes for Venezuela under Maduro's leadership, but first, how did Venezuela, once the pride of South America, go from being one of Latin America's richest countries to experiencing the single largest economic collapse in the world, not caused by war? Some trace the start of Venezuela's collapse to March 2013, the end of socialist President Hugo Chávez's 14-year rule after his death at the age of 58. His vice president and hand-picked successor, Nicolas Maduro, narrowly won election as president in April 2013. But by December 2015, with oil prices plummeting, the opposition party wins control of Venezuela's legislative body. 15 months later, in March 2017, Venezuela's Supreme Court takes over the functions of the National Assembly, sparking months of anti-government protests and the deaths of more than 100 people. In July 2017, amid a deepening recession, Maduro's government calls for a referendum to replace the National Assembly and a presidential election, which opposition leaders pledged to boycott. Despite low voter turnout and allegations of fraud, Maduro claims victory and a second 6-year term as president. But the United States and a multilateral group of 12 Latin American governments declared the 2018 election invalid. In January 2019, opposition leader Juan Guaido, virtually unknown outside Venezuela, declares himself the country's interim president and is recognized by more than 50 countries, including the United States. With millions of Venezuelans fleeing the country, the U.S. imposes a series of sanctions against Maduro loyalists and countries that do business with Venezuela, hastening the country's economic decline and putting pressure on Maduro to step down. Now, if Maduro agrees to step down, it would be up to Juan Guaido, the man who has declared himself Venezuela's rightful leader, to forge a transitional government. His claim as Venezuela's interim president has been recognized by more than 50 countries. Those countries shown in yellow include the United States, most of South America, and Western Europe. Countries still siding with Maduro are shown in red. They include China, Russia, Mexico, and Cuba. In January this year, Guaido, the 36-year-old former industrial engineer and member of the centrist Socialist Democratic Party, was appointed head of the National Assembly, Venezuela's main legislative body. According to the Venezuelan Constitution, the appointed head of the National Assembly is the de facto president in the absence of the democratically elected leader. Adriana Rabascal with VOA's Spanish service spoke with Mr. Guaido and asked him about the reported secret talks between the United States officials and Maduro loyalists.
We do
not have any information about the meetings with who we know is the anchor of the Wednesday gossip show of the regime. What we can say is that they are desperate to talk to someone. I am the official and recognized spokesperson of Venezuela with the world. We are recognized by several countries, the Monetary Fund, the World Bank. I am the only one with the capacity to generate trust within the Venezuelan people and with the international community. They believe that making fun of people is a game. They thought they made fun of the Venezuelan people last May 20th, 2018. It is very clear they are looking for some type of solution. People believe and respect us.
Do you think he is trying to save himself and give up Maduro? What do you think they're talking about?
What is clear today is that since last week, for the first time in 20 years, you hear of a miscommunication from the people in the regime. What Cabello said is different to what General Padrino Lopez said. 4 different messages in less than 1 week. What is clear to me is that there is no alignment within the regime of Nicolás Maduro. And it seems that each one is trying to save themselves. What we want is to save Venezuela. What we have been talking about since January 5th is about amnesty law that provides guarantee to all sectors for an orderly transition, for him to step down of power, orderly transition, and free elections.
Maduro has not given up power since you have been interim president for the last 7 months. The Washington Post also recently published that Nicolás Maduro would have agreed to go to elections during the negotiations with the condition that he will participate in the elections.
What I can say at this moment is that we are close to a real solution. We are going to participate in any mediation space for facilitating dialogue. We work with the international contact group that approximates us to the objectives that we have drawn from the beginning, for Maduro to step down of power, orderly transition, and free elections. During this 2019, we have seen more people in the street protesting, international recognition, and pressure, and a regime that does not have any answers. What I can tell you is that we are the majority of the Venezuelan people, and I have said it several times. This just shows how the regime has no clear message on how it's trying to reach out to the United States, Colombia, and Brazil, and how those countries are saying that the legitimate president of Venezuela is Juan Guaido.
You also recently said during an interview that elections with Maduro would not be free. Even though the country goes through a democratic transition, which consists in him stepping down of power, orderly transition and free elections, would you accept Maduro on the elections ballot?
It will be difficult to have a free democratic election with someone who is a usurper of power, with someone who exercises power regularly. We need to put an end to the suffering and madness, which has become the new normal in the daily life of any Venezuelan. It will be a farce.
Why would it be a farce to do a presidential election with Maduro?
We already have the experience about what happened in May 2018. We did not participate in the elections because we didn't have the conditions. I understand that there are some frustrations in the public opinion. However, it will be a mistake on our part to do this without any type of conditions. There have to be a minimal eligibility and participation conditions for people to be able to vote abroad.
One of those conditions is not having Maduro in power.
It would be very difficult to go to a free election with someone usurping power. We will face again a dictator. The temptation of that dictator of using the state resources to generate social pressure and to use the armed forces. We have to prevent that as much as possible.
For the United States, the challenge going forward is how to navigate difficult relationships in a rapidly changing Latin America, starting with the immigration crisis at the border. But on the issue of Venezuela, my next guest says there are no easy fixes. Patrick Duddy is director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at Duke University. And prior to that, Mr. Duddy served as U.S. ambassador to Venezuela under both President George W. Bush and President Barack Obama. He is also a former Latin American specialist at the U.S. State Department, joins us from Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. Nice to talk to you, Mr. Ambassador. And Mr. Ambassador, with the government mismanagement, the failed socialist policies, the widespread corruption, the economic sanctions, the decline in oil production to the levels of the 1940s, and you've got near famine conditions in Venezuela, and you've got 5 million refugees. How does Venezuela come out of this?
Well, I think the most important thing is to initiate a peaceful change of government. The regime of Nicolas Maduro, and before that the government of Hugo Chavez, set the country on an economic course that has proven to be absolutely catastrophic. And at the same time, they have created a permissive atmosphere in which a wide range of illegal activity also takes place. So the top priority has to be a change of government.
Would the oil market come back to Venezuela? I realize the U.S. could lift its sanctions, which would have some impact, and I suspect a significant one. But what about the oil revenue, which was so important to that country and is so important?
Well, Venezuela has tremendous reserves, arguably the greatest in the world. But during the 2 decades in which the Chavistas, the Chavez and Maduro governments have managed the oil sector, there has been a really shocking level of basically of mismanagement, and the country has failed now for 2 decades to make the necessary capital investments to permit an easy and smooth recovery. So will it recover? Absolutely. Absolutely. Will there be interest in the international community in helping them recover? Absolutely. But they are going to be starting from a very low level because the sector has deteriorated so dramatically. And this is not a function of the sanctions. This precipitous decline began years and years ago. I think Ambassador Bolton has recently, possibly in this program, mentioned that when Chavez was elected, oil production was over 3 million barrels a day. Now it's down around 700,000 barrels a day and declining. But this didn't happen overnight. This happened over a course of years.
Do you see Maduro on a ballot should there be an election, or do you agree with Mr. Guaido that it would be a farce to put him on the ballot? Is Maduro definitely just out of the picture from this day forward?
Well, in the first instance, really, the first question should be, can free and fair elections be held while Maduro continues to sit in the presidential palace? My own instinct is no, that's not really possible. Not only because he has usurped power, but because we've seen how he would manage an election, and we saw that just last May. So I can't see free and fair elections taking place while he is still in power. I would also suggest that, given his record and the catastrophically bad management of the country over the last several years, it would be very hard to imagine him on the ballot.
Thank you, sir. Former Ambassador to Venezuela, Patrick Duddy. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Before we go, some closing thoughts in another part of the world, in Nigeria, and this is good news. The World Health Organization has been analyzing health data that shows Nigeria has not seen any new cases of polio in almost 3 years. We'll see you next week.